Hello, everyone. Our topic for today is about the nature and composition of the cell membrane. In this lesson, we will discuss about the basic nature of the cell membrane and also the various biochemical components of this very dynamic cellular structure. So at the end of this lesson, you are expected to describe the nature of the cell membrane, identify the components of the cell membrane, and describe the functions of these different components of the cell membrane. So before we go to our discussion proper, let me ask you this question. Does the structure of the cell membrane affects its function? So I hope you will be able to answer that one as we end our lesson for today. So we know that the cell membrane covers the entire cell, no especially it provides protection for those cells that do not have their own cell wall, no, like the animal cells. Now in eukaryotic cell, we know that it is highly organized and it contains organelles inside, now making it distinct now from other cellular materials, now are the membranes. So membranes are not just found covering the entire cell, but are also found covering the different organelles found inside the eukaryotic cells, making it distinct from other cellular materials. So their membranes are specialized in that it contains specific proteins and lipid components that enable it to perform its unique roles. The structure of intracellular membranes is very similar to that of cell surface membranes, and almost all cellular processes involve intracellular membranes. Now, the structure of the cell membrane is best described by the fluid mosaic model. Now, this means that uh, the different lipid and protein components now are floating in the array of these different macromolecules. So this model shows that the cell membrane is made up of different protein components, no? A mosaic of different protein components that are floating in a double layer of lipid molecules. And this model also proposes that this lipid component is made up of two layers. Now, what are the different lipid components of the cell membrane? So, phospholipids, shown here, make up 75% of the lipid component of the cell surface membrane. Phospholipids are called amphipathic molecule because each phospholipid has a hydrophilic or water-loving head and a hydrophobic water-hating tail. Now that's the term amphi, meaning both ends are have different preference, for the type of polarity of the type of solution they are into. So the head is water-loving, while the tail is uh, while the tail is uh, lipid loving or water hating. So amphipathic molecules. So the lipid bilayer assembles themselves spontaneously in an aqueous environment like the extracellular fluid and the cytosol. Another lipid component of the cell membrane are the cholesterol and the glycolipids. Cholesterol makes up 20% of animal membranes and is rarely found in plants. In humans, cholesterol is present in almost the same proportion as phospholipids. So cholesterol are also amphipathic molecules. So there are lipid or hydrophobic component, and there are also hydrophilic component. So they make cell membrane more rigid and prevents it from being too fluid and breaking up. Hydrophobic regions of these cholesterol prevent ions and polar molecules from passing through the membrane. The last type of lipid that is comprising uh, the cellular membrane are the glycolipids. Now they comprise 5% of membrane lipids. So they are lipids, with uh, short carbohydrate chains attached. They occur in the external surface of the membrane. So earlier, it was referred to this as the cholesterol, but actually this is the cholesterol. So the protein component, on the other hand, are composed of different types depending on what category. So if you base that on the type of membrane proteins, then in general, there are three: the transmembrane proteins, integral proteins, and the peripheral proteins. So transmembrane proteins are those embedded in the lipid bilayer, while integral proteins are those floating within the lipid bilayer, and the peripheral proteins are those associated outside the lipid bilayer. Now, there are also some types of membrane proteins that based on their functions. So, the first one is are the transport proteins. So, they are the ones that control the movement of hydrophilic molecules through the plasma membrane. Examples are the channel proteins and the carrier proteins. Channel proteins allow small water-soluble molecules to pass through the membrane, forming pores or channels. Carrier proteins have binding sites that can temporarily attach to specific molecules on one side of the membrane, and it changes its shape and moves the molecule across the membrane. Receptor proteins is another type based on function. It triggers cellular responses when specific molecules in the extracellular fluid, such as hormones or nutrients, bind to them. The other type are the recognition proteins, which are mostly glycoproteins. So glycoproteins have short carbohydrate molecules that are attached to them. They form hydrogen bonds with water to help stabilize the membrane structure. They also act as receptors for hormones and neurotransmitters. And other glycoproteins can be antigens as well. Those molecules, no, antigens are those molecules that help cells recognize each other and are the ones that elicit an immune response. So if we look back at this fluid mosaic model of the cell membrane, we could identify these different types of proteins. So you have here the integral protein. So it is integrated, it is floating within the lipid layer. Peripheral protein, no, these are found attached to the surface of the lipid bilayer, and some transmembrane protein. No, there is actually no example of the transmembrane protein. This is also a an integral protein, but an integral protein, transmembrane protein are almost the same as this, because a transmembrane protein, no, as what we have defined, are those embedded in the lipid bilayer. So there are transmembrane that could pass multiple times, no, along the phospholipid bilayer of the cell membrane. Now, other types of proteins include this one based on function. This is a channel protein. Okay. Uh, it could also there are also globular proteins and other transport proteins. This is a glycoprotein. You have a protein attached with a carbohydrate molecules. So again, those are the different components of the cell membrane. You have the lipid and the protein components. Okay, so as you review this topic, no, to help you, you should be able to answer this question. So what factors affect the permeability of substances through the cell membrane? So the factors, if you notice, know that uh, as we talk about, the here, you will be able to see what could influence, the transport of these different uh, molecules through the membrane. Although transport mechanism will be discussed more no, on our next lesson. Okay. So explain the molecular mechanism of hydrophobic interaction and determine how it relates to the stability of the membrane. We know that the cell membrane is composed of the phospholipid bilayer, and the phospholipid bilayer has a hydrophobic tails. And these hydrophobic tails will arrange themselves so that they are less in contact with water. So this is what we call hydrophobic interaction, just like what your other courses have discussed. However, hydrophobic interaction is more than that. Because the interaction between these hydrophobic molecules is very weak. However, what makes the cell membrane stable are the interaction of the water outside and inside the cell. So we know that water are very attracted to each other because they form hydrogen bonds. With the presence of hydrophobic molecule, the hydrogen bonds are disrupted. And so there is an entropy disorder in the water molecules, and that force of disorder no will uh, intensify no, the attraction between water molecules. So there will water molecules here and water molecules here will be attracted from each other. So that force of attraction are the one that stabilizes the cell membrane. So the cell membrane is like the water is like forming the sandwich, and the cell membrane is the filling within the water molecules interacting each other. So that is what we call hydrophobic interaction. And what are the structures and functions of the different membrane lipids and proteins? So again, I hope you will be able to answer these questions now as you review this lesson. Okay, so if you have questions and some clarifications, you can contact me through my email, or you can key in your questions in our Facebook Messenger group chats. So thank you very much, and see you again in our next meeting.